The call came at 3 in the morning, piercing through Dr. Sarah Mitchell's exhausted sleep with the urgency that only wildlife emergencies carried. On the other end of the line was Marcus Rodriguez, head keeper at African Winds Conservation Center, his voice tight with emotion. A 17-year-old cheetah named Casey, who had been battling kidney disease for months, had taken a dramatic turn for the worse. She was refusing all food and water, lying motionless in her enclosure with eyes that held the distant look of an animal preparing to let go. But there was something else, something that made Marcus's voice crack as he spoke. Casey kept looking toward the entrance of her habitat, as if waiting for someone who was not coming. Sarah had been Casey's primary veterinarian for 12 years, ever since the cheetah arrived as an orphan cub whose mother had been killed by farmers protecting their livestock. The bond between doctor and patient had grown beyond professional care into something deeper, something that transcended the typical relationship between human and wild animal. Now, as Sarah threw on clothes and grabbed her emergency bag, she could not shake the feeling that this call was different from all the others. This was not about medical intervention or treatment options. This was about something far more profound and heartbreaking. If stories about the incredible bonds between wildlife caregivers and the animals they dedicate their lives to protecting move you, please consider subscribing to Compassionate Hearts. Your subscription helps us share more of these deeply touching stories that remind us of the profound connections possible between humans and the wild animals who need our help. Every subscription supports our mission to honor these relationships and the people who sacrifice everything for wildlife conservation. The drive to African Winds Conservation Center took 40 minutes through winding country roads that Sarah had traveled countless times over the past decade. Each familiar landmark triggered memories of Casey at different stages of her life. The old oak tree where Sarah had once stopped to take a call about Casey's first successful hunt in her enclosure. The bridge over Miller Creek where she had pulled over 2 years ago to cry after Casey's initial kidney disease diagnosis. The curve near Thompson Farm where she had received the joyful news that Casey had bonded with another rescued cheetah, bringing companionship into her solitary existence. But tonight, the familiar route felt like a journey toward an ending that Sarah was not ready to face. Casey had been more than just another patient in Sarah's care. The cheetah represented everything Sarah loved about wildlife medicine, everything that had drawn her away from comfortable domestic veterinary practice toward the unpredictable, heartbreaking, and ultimately rewarding world of conservation medicine. Losing Casey would not just be losing a patient. It would be losing a piece of her own heart. The Conservation Center sat on 300 acres of carefully maintained habitat designed to house rescued big cats who could not be returned to the wild. Sarah had been instrumental in its design, working with architects and animal behaviorists to create spaces that honored the psychological and physical needs of apex predators living in human care. Casey's enclosure was Sarah's masterpiece, a sprawling area with varied terrain, natural vegetation, and elevated platforms that allowed the cheetah to survey her territory from multiple vantage points. Every detail had been planned with Casey specifically in mind. Marcus met Sarah at the main gate, his usually composed demeanor cracked with exhaustion and grief. He had been with Kessie almost as long as Sarah, transitioning from junior keeper to head of the big cat department while maintaining his special relationship with the spotted predator who had taught him everything about cheetah behavior and psychology. His dark eyes held the same desperate hope that Sarah felt burning in her own chest. Maybe Sarah's presence would make a difference. Maybe Kessie was waiting for her primary caregiver before making her final decision about whether to keep fighting. The walk to Kessie's enclosure felt both too long and too short. Sarah needed time to prepare herself for what she might find, but she also desperately wanted to reach Casey as quickly as possible. Marcus filled the silence with medical updates, though Sarah barely registered the words. Kidney function had declined dramatically over the past week. Appetite had disappeared entirely 3 days ago. Kessie had stopped responding to enrichment activities, stopped acknowledging the presence of her companion cheetah in the adjacent enclosure, stopped displaying any of the behaviors that made her uniquely herself. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the center's other veterinarian, had maintained a vigil since the previous evening, monitoring Kessie's vital signs and providing supportive care. Elizabeth was younger than Sarah, brilliant and dedicated, but she lacked the deep personal connection that Sarah had forged with KZ over more than a decade. Elizabeth could provide excellent medical care, but she could not provide the emotional anchor that Casey seemed to be seeking in her final hours. The habitat came into view under the harsh glare of emergency lighting that had been installed for nighttime medical interventions. Casey lay on her favorite platform, an elevated rocky outcropping that provided a perfect view of the surrounding area. Even in her weakened state, she had chosen the position that best satisfied her instincts as a visual predator. Her golden coat with its distinctive black spots looked dull under the artificial light, and her normally alert posture had given way to the relaxed position of an animal whose body was beginning to shut down. But as Sarah approached the observation area, something remarkable happened. Casey's head lifted slightly, her amber eyes focusing with an intensity that had been absent for days. The cheetah's ears moved forward, and she made a soft vocalization, a sound Sarah had heard thousands of times over the years. It was Casey's greeting call, the sound she made when Sarah arrived for routine visits, medical examinations, or simply to spend time in quiet companionship. Despite her failing body, despite the medical crisis ravaging her system, Kessie recognized Sarah's presence and responded with joy. Sarah's professional composure cracked for a moment as tears blurred her vision. She had seen many animals die over the course of her career, had made the difficult decision to end suffering when medical intervention could no longer provide meaningful relief. But she had never experienced anything quite like this moment, when a dying animal summoned the strength to acknowledge the arrival of someone who mattered to them. Casey was not just recognizing Sarah's presence, she was demonstrating that human connections could transcend species barriers, even in the face of death. Marcus activated the entry protocols that would allow Sarah to enter the habitat safely. Casey had never shown aggression toward humans, but protocols existed for good reasons, and even dying predators could be unpredictable if startled or frightened. Sarah moved slowly and deliberately, using the calm body language that had become second nature after years of working with big cats. She spoke softly as she approached, using the gentle tone that Casey associated with safety and care. The cheetah watched Sarah's approach with growing alertness, her breathing becoming slightly more animated as her primary caregiver drew closer. When Sarah was within 10 feet of the platform, Casey attempted to rise, pushing herself up on unsteady legs that betrayed the weakness ravaging her body. The effort was enormous, clearly exhausting, but Casey was determined to greet Sarah properly, to maintain the dignity that had always characterized their relationship. Sarah climbed onto the platform slowly, settling beside Casey with the practiced ease of someone who had shared the space countless times over the years. The cheetah immediately moved closer, pressing her head against Sarah's leg in the greeting gesture that had become their private ritual. The contact was warm and familiar, but Sarah could feel how much weight Casey had lost, how fragile her once powerful frame had become. The purring that began in Casey's throat was softer than usual, but unmistakably genuine. A sound of contentment and recognition that made Sarah's heart break and soar simultaneously. For several minutes, they sat together in silence, doctor and patient, human and cheetah. Two beings whose lives had become intertwined through years of shared experiences, medical challenges, small victories, and deep affection. Sarah ran her hands through Casey's coat, feeling the familiar texture of the fur she had examined during countless health checks, treatments, and simple moments of companionship. The cheetah's breathing was labored but steady, and her purring continued, as if Sarah's presence had given her renewed energy to fight through the pain. Elizabeth Harper approached the platform cautiously, carrying medical equipment and wearing the expression of someone who understood the gravity of what they were witnessing. She had been monitoring Kessie's condition throughout the night, documenting the steady decline in vital signs and the cheetah's lack of response to any stimuli. But now, with Sarah's arrival, Kessie was displaying behaviors that had been absent for days. The cheetah was alert, responsive, and clearly drawing comfort from human companionship in a way that challenged everything Elizabeth thought she understood about wild animals facing death. The medical examination that followed was gentle but thorough. Sarah needed to assess Kesey's current condition to understand whether there were any treatment options remaining or whether they were facing the inevitable decision that every wildlife veterinarian dreaded. Kessie tolerated the examination with patience that spoke to the trust she placed in Sarah's hands. Blood pressure was critically low. Kidney function had deteriorated to the point where toxins were building up in her system. Her body temperature was dropping as her metabolism slowed. By every medical measure, Kessie was dying. But something extraordinary was happening that could not be measured by medical equipment or quantified in veterinary textbooks. Kessie's emotional response to Sarah's presence was so profound that it was temporarily overriding the physical crisis consuming her body. The cheetah was choosing to remain alert and engaged rather than slipping into the unconsciousness that would have been a merciful escape from her failing organs. She was fighting to stay present for this final interaction with a human who had been her constant companion through every stage of her captive life. Marcus joined them on the platform, bringing with him the comfortable familiarity of the keeper who knew Kesey's personality better than anyone except Sarah. The cheetah acknowledged his presence with a soft chuff, but kept her primary focus on the veterinarian who had been her anchor through years of medical challenges and routine care. It was becoming clear that Casey had been waiting specifically for Sarah, holding on through hours of increasing discomfort because some instinct told her that their relationship deserved a proper farewell. As dawn began to break over the conservation center, casting soft light across the habitat that had been Casey's home for more than a decade, the three humans who had dedicated their lives to her care faced the reality that time was running out. But they also faced something beautiful and profound, a demonstration of interspecies connection that would forever change how they understood the emotional lives of the wild animals in their care. The decision that every wildlife caregiver dreads hung heavy in the morning air as Sarah continued her gentle examination of Casey's failing body. The cheetah's kidneys were beyond medical intervention. Her liver was struggling to process the toxins building in her bloodstream, and her heart rate had become irregular as her cardiovascular system began the process of shutting down. Yet Casey remained conscious, alert, and focused entirely on Sarah's presence, as if the bond between them was providing the strength to endure what should have been unbearable pain. Dr. Harper quietly reviewed the medical options, though everyone present understood that they were discussing comfort measures rather than curative treatments. Pain medication could ease Casey's suffering, but it would also likely accelerate the dying process by suppressing her already compromised respiratory system. Intravenous fluids might temporarily improve her kidney function, but would ultimately prolong her discomfort without changing the inevitable outcome. The kindest choice, the most professional choice, would be to end Casey's suffering before it became any more severe. But as Sarah looked into Casey's amber eyes, she saw something that complicated the straightforward medical decision. The cheetah was not displaying the vacant, distant expression of an animal ready to surrender to death. Instead, her gaze held intelligence, awareness, and what could only be described as purposeful communication. Casey was trying to tell Sarah something, and until that message was delivered and received, the cheetah was determined to keep fighting through the pain that racked her deteriorating body. Marcus had seen this phenomenon before in his years caring for big cats, though never quite so pronounced as what they were witnessing with Casey. Some animals seem to possess an innate understanding of their own mortality, and when that awareness combined with deep emotional bonds to their caregivers, extraordinary things could happen. Animals would rally their remaining strength for final interactions that served purposes beyond human comprehension. They would wait for specific people, seek out particular locations, or engage in behaviors that suggested they were trying to complete some essential task before allowing death to claim them. The morning routine at African Winds Conservation Center continued around them, as other staff members arrived to care for the dozens of rescued animals that called the facility home. But word of Kessie's condition had spread, and many of the keepers, veterinary assistants, and administrative staff found reasons to walk past her enclosure. Cassie had been at the center longer than most of the current staff, and her gentle nature had made her a favorite among everyone who worked there. She had never shown aggression toward humans, had always cooperated during medical procedures, and had served as an ambassador for her species during the educational programs that helped fund the Conservation Center's operations. Sarah noticed that Casey's breathing was becoming more labored as the morning progressed, but the cheetah's mental focus remained sharp. When a keeper approached with fresh water, Casey tracked the movement with her eyes but made no attempt to drink. When her companion Cheetah in the adjacent enclosure called out, Casey's ears rotated toward the sound, but she did not respond vocally. Every bit of her remaining energy was being conserved for this interaction with Sarah, as if the veterinarian's presence was the only thing that mattered in her final hours. The decision to allow nature to take its course, rather than intervening medically to hasten Casey's death, was unprecedented in Sarah's career. Professional protocol dictated that suffering animals should be humanely euthanized before their condition deteriorated further. Allowing a patient to die naturally when medical intervention was available went against every principle of veterinary medicine. But this situation transcended normal protocols because Casey was clearly experiencing something beyond physical pain. The cheetah was engaged in a process that was emotional, psychological, and perhaps even spiritual in nature. Elizabeth Harper documented everything in meticulous detail, recognizing that they were witnessing something that could contribute to scientific understanding of animal consciousness and emotional capacity. The way Casey responded to Sarah's presence, the obvious comfort she derived from human companionship, and her determination to remain alert despite her medical condition, all suggested levels of cognitive and emotional complexity that challenged traditional assumptions about wild animal psychology. This was not just a dying cheetah seeking comfort. This was an individual being with preferences, relationships, and perhaps even a sense of ceremony around her own passing. As the sun climbed higher, casting warm light across the platform where Sarah and Casey sat together, the cheetah's purring became intermittent but never stopped entirely. Each time Sarah moved her hand to a different part of Casey's body, the purring would resume, as if the cheetah was expressing gratitude for every moment of contact. When Sarah spoke softly, Casey's ears would perk forward and her eyes would focus more intently, demonstrating that she was not only aware of Sarah's presence, but was actively listening to her voice. The other animals at the Conservation Center seemed to sense that something significant was happening. The big cats in nearby enclosures had become unusually quiet, and several were positioned at the edges of their habitats closest to Casey's area. Lions, tigers, leopards, and other rescued predators that rarely paid attention to activities outside their own territories were all oriented toward the platform where their fellow resident was saying goodbye to the human who had cared for her, since cubhood Marcus brought a comfortable cushion for Sarah to sit on, recognizing that this vigil might continue for hours. He also brought water and snacks, understanding that Sarah would not willingly leave Casey's side until the end came. The headkeeper had witnessed many animal deaths during his career, but he had never seen a dying creature fight so hard to remain conscious and connected to a human companion. Casey's determination was both heartbreaking and inspiring, demonstrating the depth of attachment that could develop between species when care was provided with genuine love and respect. Dr. Harper conducted periodic assessments of Casey's vital signs without disturbing the interaction between Cheetah and veterinarian. Heart rate continued to decline, body temperature was dropping steadily, and kidney function was essentially non-existent. By every medical measure, Kessie should have lapsed into unconsciousness hours ago. Her continued alertness defied physiological expectations and suggested that psychological factors were playing a role in her body's response to organ failure. The conversation between Sarah and Kessie was largely nonverbal, conducted through touch, eye contact, and subtle vocalizations that had developed their own meaning over 12 years of shared experiences. Sarah would place her hand on different parts of Kessie's body, and the cheetah would respond with purrs, chuffs, or slight movements that indicated pleasure or comfort. When Sarah shifted position on the platform, Kessie would adjust her own posture to maintain contact, ensuring that some part of her body was always touching the veterinarian who had become the most important human in her world. Memories flooded through Sarah's mind as she sat with her dying patient. She remembered the first time she had seen Kessie as a terrified, malnourished cub whose mother had been killed by farmers. The young cheetah had been so small that she could fit in Sarah's lap. Trembling with fear and confusion at finding herself in human care, Sarah recalled the painstaking process of gaining Kessie's trust. The gradual transformation from a traumatized orphan to a confident predator who viewed her enclosure as home rather than prison. There had been medical crises over the years that had tested both their resolve. A severe respiratory infection when Kessie was 3 years old that required weeks of intensive treatment. An injury to her front paw from a fall that had necessitated surgery and months of rehabilitation. The diagnosis of kidney disease 2 years earlier that had changed everything about Kessie's care routine. Through each challenge, Sarah and Kessie had faced the difficulties together, building a relationship based on mutual trust, respect, and genuine affection. The educational programs where Kessie had served as an ambassador for her species had created countless memorable moments. School groups would gasp in wonder when they saw the elegant cheetah moving across her habitat with fluid grace. Adult visitors would fall silent when Sarah explained the threats facing wild cheetahs and the conservation efforts working to protect the species. Kessie seemed to understand her role in these presentations, often positioning herself where she could be easily observed and displaying natural behaviors that illustrated the points Sarah was making about cheetah ecology and conservation needs. But perhaps the most precious memories were the quiet moments, the routine veterinary checks that had become opportunities for companionship rather than just medical necessity. Kessie had learned to associate Sarah's arrival with positive experiences, greeting her with vocalizations and body language that communicated joy and anticipation. Even procedures that should have been stressful, like blood draws or dental examinations, became collaborative efforts because of the trust that existed between them. As afternoon approached, Kessie's condition continued to deteriorate despite her remarkable mental alertness. Her breathing became increasingly shallow, and her body temperature dropped to levels that indicated her metabolism was slowing dramatically. But her eyes remained fixed on Sarah's face, and her purring continued whenever Sarah spoke or touched her. The cheetah was using every ounce of her remaining strength to maintain this connection, to ensure that their final interaction was meaningful and complete. The staff at African Winds Conservation Center had canceled all non-essential activities for the day, creating an atmosphere of respectful quiet around Casey's enclosure. Visitors had been redirected to other areas of the facility, and only essential personnel were allowed near the habitat where one of their most beloved residents was spending her final hours. The sense of loss was palpable throughout the organization, but there was also recognition that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a demonstration of interspecies bonding that few people would ever have the privilege to observe. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the platform as Kessie's breathing became more irregular, each breath requiring visible effort from her weakened diaphragm. Sarah could feel the changes happening beneath her hands as she maintained gentle contact with the cheetah's chest, monitoring the gradual slowing of her heart rate through touch rather than medical equipment. This was not about clinical measurements anymore. This was about presence, about honoring a relationship that had transcended the boundaries between wild animal and human caregiver through years of shared trust and mutual respect. Marcus positioned himself at a respectful distance, close enough to assist if needed, but far enough away to preserve the intimacy of the moment between Sarah and Casey. He had been documenting the entire interaction with photographs that would become part of the Conservation Center's historical record, but also served a more personal purpose. These images captured the profound bond that could develop between humans and the wild animals in their care when that care was provided with genuine love rather than mere professional duty. Dr. Harper made notes about Kessie's responses that would contribute to veterinary literature about end-of-life behavior in captive big cats. The cheetah's determination to remain conscious and engaged despite severe organ failure challenged conventional understanding of how animals experience dying. Most creatures in Kessie's condition would have surrendered to unconsciousness hours earlier, seeking the merciful escape that comes when the brain shuts down to protect itself from pain. But Kessie was choosing awareness over comfort, connection over relief. The decision to forego aggressive medical intervention was becoming validated by what they were witnessing. Casey was not suffering in the way that medical textbooks suggested she should be. Her body language showed discomfort but not agony. Her breathing was labored but not panicked. Most significantly, her emotional state appeared peaceful, even content, as long as Sarah remained beside her. The cheetah had found a way to transcend her physical crisis through the strength of the bond she shared with her primary caregiver. A gentle breeze moved through the habitat, carrying with it the sense of the surrounding forest that had always been part of Casey's environment at African Winds Conservation Center. Her nostrils flared slightly as familiar odors registered in her consciousness, connecting her to the natural world that existed beyond the boundaries of her enclosure. For a moment, her eyes left Sarah's face to scan the tree line, as if she was taking a final inventory of the territory that had been her home for most of her life. Sarah followed Casey's gaze towards the forest, understanding that the cheetah was processing more than just her immediate surroundings. This was a creature who had been born wild, who carried in her genetic memory the knowledge of vast savannas and endless horizons that her species had roamed for millennia. The fact that she had chosen to spend her final hours focused on a human relationship rather than retreating into whatever wild instincts remained in her consciousness, spoke to the profound impact of their years together. The other rescued cheetahs in the adjacent enclosures had been unusually quiet throughout the day, as if they sensed the gravity of what was happening to their former companion. Cheetahs in the wild were typically solitary creatures, but in captivity, they sometimes formed social bonds that provided psychological comfort. Casey had lived alone for most of her time at the conservation center, but she had always been aware of the other members of her species nearby, drawing some measure of security from their presence even when direct interaction was limited. As the afternoon progressed, Casey began making soft vocalizations that Sarah had never heard before, sounds that seemed to come from deep in her chest and carried emotional weight that transcended typical cheetah communication. These were not calls directed at other cheetahs or responses to external stimuli. They were sounds meant specifically for Sarah, expressions of something that could only be described as gratitude mixed with farewell. The veterinarian found herself responding with equally soft words, creating a dialogue that bridged species barriers through pure emotional connection. The physical changes in Casey's condition were becoming more pronounced as her organs continued to fail. Her gums had taken on a pale color that indicated poor circulation, and her extremities were becoming cooled to the touch as her body prioritized blood flow to essential organs. But her eyes remained bright and focused, tracking Sarah's every movement and responding to her voice with subtle shifts in expression that demonstrated continued mental acuity. Elizabeth Harper quietly administered a mild pain medication that would ease Kessie's discomfort without accelerating the dying process. The cheetah barely reacted to the injection, so focused was she on maintaining eye contact with Sarah. The medication took effect gradually, relaxing some of the tension in Casey's muscles without diminishing her awareness or her determination to remain present for this final interaction with the human who had been her constant throughout years of captivity. The Conservation Center's director, Maria Santos, arrived as evening approached, bringing with her a quiet dignity that acknowledged the significance of what was happening. Maria had overseen the facility for 15 years and had witnessed many animal deaths, but she recognized that Casey's passing was different. This was not just the loss of another rescued predator. This was the end of a relationship that had defined both the cheetah's life and Sarah's career in wildlife medicine. Staff members who had worked with Kessie over the years began gathering at respectful distances around the habitat, creating an informal vigil that honored the cheetah's contribution to their understanding of big cat behavior and conservation needs. Keepers who had prepared her meals, veterinary assistants who had helped with medical procedures, and administrative staff who had included her in educational programs all came to pay their respects to an animal who had touched their lives in countless ways. The golden light of late afternoon illuminated Casey's coat, highlighting the intricate pattern of spots that made each cheetah as individual as human fingerprints. Sarah had memorized every marking on Kessie's body through years of examinations and treatments, but now she found herself seeing them with new eyes, appreciating the artistry of evolution that had created such a perfect predator. Even in her weakened state, Kessie retained the elegant proportions and graceful lines that made cheetahs the most specialized of all big cats. Memories of successful moments in Casey's care flooded through Sarah's mind as she continued her gentle vigil. The first time Cassie had successfully taken down prey in her enclosure, demonstrating that her hunting instincts remained intact despite her captive upbringing. The day she had shown interest in a new enrichment toy, engaging with her environment in ways that indicated psychological well-being. The afternoon she had chosen to rest in a sunny spot rather than hiding in shadows, suggesting that she felt secure in her territory. But perhaps the most meaningful memory was much simpler. It was the first time Casey had approached Sarah voluntarily, choosing to make contact rather than merely tolerating human presence. That moment had marked the beginning of their true relationship, the point at which professional duty had transformed into genuine partnership between two beings who had found something valuable in each other's company. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the windows of the observation building. Casey's breathing had become increasingly shallow, but she remained alert and focused on Sarah's presence. The cheetah's tail, which had been still for most of the day, began moving slightly, not with the aggressive lashing of an agitated cat, but with the gentle rhythm of an animal expressing contentment despite her physical distress. Dr. Harper noted that Casey's heart rate had stabilized at a very low but steady rhythm, as if the cheetah had found a way to conserve her remaining energy for this essential interaction. Blood pressure readings, when they could be obtained without disturbing the pair on the platform, showed values that should have resulted in unconsciousness. Yet Casey continued to demonstrate awareness and emotional responsiveness that defied medical explanation. Marcus brought a blanket as the evening air began to cool, draping it carefully over Casey's hindquarters without disrupting her position next to Sarah. The cheetah acknowledged his gesture with a soft chuff, but her primary attention remained fixed on the veterinarian who had been her anchor through every challenge of her captive life. The blanket provided warmth that Casey's failing circulatory system could no longer generate, but more importantly, it represented the continued care and respect that had always characterized her treatment at African Winds Conservation Center. As darkness began to settle over the habitat, artificial lighting was adjusted to provide gentle illumination that would not disturb the animals, but would allow Sarah to monitor Casey's condition throughout what would likely be their final night together. The cheetah's pupils dilated slightly in response to the changing light, but her gaze never wavered from Sarah's face, as if she was memorizing every detail of the human who had meant so much to her throughout her life in captivity. The vigil continued as stars appeared in the darkening sky above them, witnessed by the dedicated staff who had made Casey's welfare their life's work. In the distance, the calls of wild animals reminded everyone present that beyond the boundaries of the conservation center, the natural world continued its ancient rhythms. But here, on this platform, time seemed suspended as two beings from different species shared a moment that transcended the ordinary boundaries of life and death, creating something beautiful and profound from what should have been simply a medical emergency. The temperature dropped as midnight approached, and Sarah could feel the subtle changes in Casey's body that indicated her systems were beginning their final shutdown. The cheetah's breathing had become so shallow that Sarah had to place her hand directly on Casey's chest to detect each breath. Yet somehow, impossibly, those amber eyes remained open and aware, tracking Sarah's movements with the same intelligence that had characterized their relationship for over a decade. This was not the vacant stare of an animal lost to pain medication or organ failure. They was conscious choice, a determination to remain present that spoke to something deeper than mere biology. Marcus had dozed fitfully in a chair positioned near the platform, waking every hour to check on the pair and document any changes in Casey's condition. Each time he stirred, he found the same scene. Sarah maintaining her gentle contact with the dying cheetah, while Casey focused entirely on her primary caregiver's presence. The headkeeper had witnessed many animal deaths during his career, but nothing had prepared him for the emotional intensity of watching a creature choose awareness over the mercy of unconsciousness, simply to spend more time with a beloved human. Dr. Harper continued her periodic assessments throughout the night, marveling at readings that should have been incompatible with consciousness. Casey's blood pressure had dropped to levels that typically resulted in immediate coma. Her body temperature was barely registering on standard thermometers, and her kidney function had ceased entirely. By every medical standard, the cheetah should have been unconscious hours ago. Yet she continued to purr softly whenever Sarah spoke, continued to adjust her position to maintain physical contact, continued to demonstrate emotional engagement that defied physiological possibility. The other animals at African Winds Conservation Center had settled into unusual patterns throughout the night. The typically vocal lions remained silent. The normally restless tigers lay still in their enclosures, and even the smaller cats seemed to sense that something significant was happening. It was as if the entire facility was holding its breath, waiting with respectful quiet for Casey to complete whatever essential task was keeping her tethered to consciousness, despite her body's desperate need to surrender. Sarah found herself sharing memories with Casey in whispered words that carried across the quiet habitat. She spoke about the early days when Casey had been so small and frightened, about the gradual building of trust between them, about the pride Sarah had felt watching Casey develop into a magnificent adult despite her traumatic beginning. The cheetah's responses were subtle but unmistakable, slight changes in purring intensity or gentle movements that indicated she was not only hearing but processing every word. The bond between them had evolved far beyond the typical relationship between veterinarian and patient. Over 12 years, Sarah had become something like a surrogate parent to Casey, providing not just medical care, but emotional support, consistent presence, and the kind of deep affection that transcended professional boundaries. Now in these final hours, that relationship was sustaining Casey through what should have been unbearable physical distress, giving her the strength to remain present for a farewell that both of them seemed to understand was necessary. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with pale light, Casey's condition underwent another subtle shift. Her breathing became even more labored, requiring visible effort with each inhalation. Her heart rate, which had remained surprisingly steady throughout the night, began to show signs of irregularity. But her mental focus remained sharp, her eyes still tracking Sarah's movements, her purring still responding to gentle words and touches. The cheetah was approaching the final threshold, but she was facing it with dignity and grace that left everyone present deeply moved. Sarah could feel the approaching end in the subtle changes beneath her hands. Casey's chest was rising and falling with increasing difficulty. Her pulse was becoming threadier and more irregular, and her body temperature was dropping to levels that indicated her metabolism was finally shutting down. Yet the cheetah continued to fight for consciousness, continued to engage with her beloved caregiver, continued to demonstrate that their relationship meant more to her than the relief that unconsciousness would provide. The conversation between them had shifted from words to pure emotional communication, conducted through touch and eye contact that conveyed everything that needed to be said. Sarah's hands moved gently across Casey's fur, providing comfort and reassurance while monitoring the gradual failure of her patient's vital systems. The cheetah's responses grew softer, but never stopped entirely. Small sounds and movements that maintained the connection between them, even as her body prepared for its final surrender. Marcus had awakened as the sky began to lighten, immediately sensing the change in atmosphere around the platform. Casey's breathing had become so shallow that he had to watch carefully to detect each breath. But her eyes remained open and focused on Sarah with unwavering attention. The headkeeper understood that they were witnessing the final chapter of an extraordinary relationship, a demonstration of interspecies bonding that would stay with him for the rest of his career in wildlife conservation. Dr. Harper approached the platform with reverent quiet, recognizing that they had moved beyond medical intervention into something that belonged entirely to Sarah and Kessie. Her instruments could measure the cheetah's failing vital signs, but they could not quantify the emotional strength that was keeping her conscious, could not explain the choice she was making to remain present despite the physical cost. This was about love and loyalty, and the profound connections that could develop between humans and wild animals when care was provided with genuine dedication. The sunrise cast golden light across the habitat, illuminating the platform where Sarah and Kessie shared their final moments together. The cheetah's breathing had become so faint that Sarah had to lean close to feel the warmth of each exhalation against her skin. But Casey's eyes remained bright, still reflecting the intelligence and personality that had made her such a remarkable individual throughout her years in captivity. She was choosing to spend her last reserves of energy on this interaction, on ensuring that their relationship received the farewell it deserved. Other staff members began arriving for the morning shift, but word had spread throughout the organization that Casey was in her final hours. People moved with unusual quiet around the facility, speaking in hushed tones and avoiding any activities that might disturb the vigil taking place at the cheetah's enclosure. Everyone who worked at African Winds Conservation Center understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a testament to the bonds that could form between dedicated caregivers and the wild animals whose lives they had devoted themselves to protecting. Sarah could feel her own exhaustion after the long night, but she would not consider leaving Kessie's side while the cheetah continued to fight for consciousness. This was not about professional duty anymore. This was about honoring a relationship that had defined both their lives, about ensuring that Kessie's final experience was one of love and companionship rather than clinical detachment. The veterinarian who had saved an orphan cub 12 years ago was now receiving the greatest gift that cub could offer in return: the privilege of being present for her peaceful departure from the world. The morning light revealed the full scope of Casey's physical decline, but it also illuminated something beautiful in her determination to remain connected to Sarah, despite the overwhelming urge her body must have felt to surrender to unconsciousness. Her coat, though dulled by illness, still bore the distinctive markings that made her unique among all the cheetahs Sarah had ever known. Her posture, though weakened, retained traces of the elegant grace that had made her such a magnificent representative of her species throughout her life in captivity. As the sun climbed higher, casting warm rays across the platform where they had spent so many hours together over the years, Sarah realized that Casey was giving her something precious beyond measure. The cheetah was demonstrating that their relationship had meaning that transcended the boundaries of species, that the love and care Sarah had provided throughout Casey's life had been received and returned in ways that defied scientific explanation. This was not just about a dying animal seeking comfort. This was about two beings who had found something essential in each other, something worth fighting for even in the face of death itself. As the morning sun reached its peak, Casey's breathing became so faint that Sarah could barely detect the rise and fall of her chest. The cheetah's amber eyes, which had remained fixed on Sarah's face throughout the long night, began to show the distant look that comes when life finally prepares to depart. But even then, even as her body surrendered to the inevitable, Casey managed one final gesture that would forever remain etched in Sarah's memory. The dying cheetah pressed her head against Sarah's hand with the last of her strength, purring so softly it was barely audible, a sound of gratitude and love that transcended every boundary between human and wild animal. When Casey's breathing finally stopped, when her magnificent heart beat its last rhythm, Sarah remained beside her for another hour, her hand resting on the still warm fur that had been her constant companion through 12 years of shared experiences. The cheetah had chosen to spend her final moments not in solitary retreat or medicated unconsciousness, but in active connection with the human who had meant everything to her. In refusing food until Sarah arrived, in fighting consciousness to share one last interaction, Casey had given everyone present a profound lesson about the depths of emotion and loyalty that wild animals were capable of experiencing. The story of Sarah and Casey reminds us that the bonds formed between wildlife caregivers and the animals in their charge can transcend professional duty to become something far more meaningful. These relationships, built on years of trust, care, and genuine affection, prove that love knows no boundaries of species when it is offered with complete dedication. Casey's final gift to Sarah was the demonstration that their 12 years together had mattered deeply to them both, that the orphan cub, who had once trembled in Sarah's arms, had grown into a magnificent creature capable of choosing love over comfort, connection over solitude, even in her final moments.